Hi friends, my name is Cindy. I am one of the children's librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. And today we're going to finish our reading of Who Was Frederick Douglass by April Jones Prince. Later, Frederick recalled little of what he said, but he remembered the excitement of the audience. Whites in the North had never heard a slave speak about the terrible lives slaves led. Frederick's story was powerful. After the meeting, the Anti-Slavery Society offered Frederick work as a speaker. Frederick didn't think he could do a good job. More important, speaking out might help the alouds find and capture him. But the society kept asking, and Frederick agreed to try. For 4 years, Frederick traveled across New England, then south and west to New York, Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. With his deep voice, sharp eyes, tall form, and passionate words, he told Americans about his childhood in slavery. He was serious, but also smart, touching, and funny. Large crowds came to hear him in parks, halls, churches, and schoolhouses. He could make them laugh and cry. Speaking up took real courage. Some didn't welcome his message. They yelled insults and threw bricks, rotten eggs, or vegetables at him. In one town in Indiana, Frederick was attacked by a mob and had his hand broken. But Frederick pressed on, feeling that if people knew the brutal nature of slavery as he did, they would rush to end it. To avoid being captured, Frederick was careful never to give his real name, the names of his owners, or the places he had lived. At first, he was content to describe his experiences in slavery. After months of telling the same story, he began not only describing slavery, but speaking out against it. He also talked about the poor treatment of blacks in the North. Often, hotels and restaurants would not serve him. On trains, he had to sit in the dirty, uncomfortable, colored car. Once he paid for a first-class ticket and refused to leave the whites-only section. The conductor called several brakemen to remove him, but Frederick held tight to his seat. It took 6 men to throw him off the train, seat and all. In 1845, Frederick published the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. This book revealed the facts he had withheld for 4 years, his real name and where he was from. The one thing he did not describe was his escape to protect other slaves who might try to escape the same way. Narrative was an instant bestseller. It was especially popular in the North and steered more people to the anti-slavery cause. But Frederick was now in even more danger. Though he had many powerful friends who would protect him, that didn't mean a slave catcher couldn't trap him and spirit him away. Chapter 6, The North Star. The idea of being captured haunted Frederick. By law, he still belonged to the alouds. After making sure that the money from his book sales would go directly to Anna, Frederick left the household in her capable hands and fled to England. There, in Ireland and Scotland, he gave speeches in nearly all the large cities and towns, asking for help ending American slavery. Already famous in America, Frederick became well known in Europe as well. Frederick was amazed to find that in England, blacks were treated the same as whites. Whether on a train or in a restaurant, hotel, or church, he was welcome without concern for his color. No one insulted him or threw him out, as they often did in America. He felt refreshed, and for the first time, truly free. It was tempting to move his families overseas, but Frederick felt he must go home. How else could he help the millions still enslaved? And here's a picture of him at an English restaurant. Then a group of his English friends did something remarkable. They raised money to buy Frederick's freedom from the alouds. And the alouds agreed. In exchange for 150 British pounds, or about $700, Hugh Auld signed papers freeing Frederick forever. Freedom! Now Frederick could devote himself freely to his life's work of ending slavery. After 21 months abroad, Frederick returned to America with plans of starting his own anti-slavery newspaper. He moved his family to Rochester, New York, where there was a strong abolitionist community. And here's a map. Frederick published the first issue of his paper, the North Star, in 1847. The paper, named after the star that guided runaway slaves to freedom, published accounts of escaped slaves and news about successful free blacks. It printed stories and poems by black writers. It spoke out against the poor treatment of blacks in the North. The North Star made Frederick a true leader of his people. In 1851, he would rename the publication Frederick Douglass's paper. In his newspaper and in his talks, Frederick also spoke up for women's rights. Women could not vote. In most states, they could not own property. The few jobs open to them did not pay well. Women were expected to marry, keep house, and raise children while their husbands handled outside affairs. In 1848, America's first women's rights convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York. Frederick attended the event and supported it in the North Star. Frederick's work as an abolitionist did not stop with his newspaper or speeches. His house in Rochester was also a stop or station on the Underground Railroad. This railroad had no tracks or trains. Instead, it was a network of people and houses that helped slaves escape from the South. As conductors on this railroad, Frederick and Anna provided food and shelter to runaways before seeing them off on the last leg of their journey to freedom in Canada. Harriet Tubman, the Black Moses. Harriet Tubman was born a slave in Maryland around 1820. As a young woman, she escaped slavery on the Underground Railroad. She then risked her own freedom to return to the South again and again, helping more than 300 slaves, including members of her family, reach freedom in the North. As the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad, Harriet was proud to say, "I never ran my train off the track and I never lost a passenger." Frederick's work on the Underground Railroad brought him unspeakable joy, but helping runaway slaves was risky. He and Anna could be fined up to $1,000 and sent to jail. Frederick and others began to worry that peaceful means were not enough to achieve their goals. One white man who wanted to use force to end slavery was Frederick's friend and fellow abolitionist, John Brown. In 1859, Brown asked Frederick to join him in a raid to steal government weapons at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. This is John Brown. Brown planned to give the weapons to slaves so they could fight against their masters. Brown hoped that a mass rebellion of slaves would end slavery once and for all. Frederick was sure the plan would fail. He told Brown he would not be part of it. Brown did secure the weapons from an arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, but about half of his men were killed, and he and some of the others were captured by U.S. soldiers that day. Officials found letters from Frederick in John Brown's carpetbag. Frederick had nothing to do with the raid. However, he knew no one would believe this. With government officials on his tail, Frederick fled to Canada. From Canada, Frederick left for England, only to return 6 months later when word came that his youngest child, Annie, had died. Deeply saddened, Frederick took the first steamer home, no matter what danger awaited him. Back in America, he found that to a growing number of people, Brown had become a hero. The United States was now focused on the presidential election of 1860. Frederick supported Republican Abraham Lincoln, the only candidate who opposed the spread of slavery. Although Frederick did not agree with everything Lincoln stood for, he threw himself into the campaigning for him. Chapter 7, War Between the States. Abraham Lincoln won the election. He took office on March 4, 1861. In the 6 months following the election, fearing Lincoln would end slavery, 11 states in the South seceded or broke away from the United States. Together, they formed the Confederate States of America and elected their own president. And on April 12, 1861, Confederate troops attacked a Union garrison at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. To Lincoln, the purpose of the war was to defeat the Confederacy and bring the Southern states back into the Union. To Frederick, it was that and more. It was a battle over slavery. Frederick was determined to ensure that if the Union won, slavery would be abolished forever. Here's a map of what it looked like. From the start, Frederick felt strongly that all slaves should be freed and allowed to serve in the Union Army. This would show Americans that blacks were as brave and deserving of liberty as whites. And with slaves fighting for the Union, the South would be drained of its workforce. Lincoln, however, was slow to act. To achieve his goals, Frederick gave hundreds of speeches, wrote to the country's leaders, and spoke out in his newspaper, which he had renamed Douglass's Monthly. By 1862, with the war still raging, the Union needed more troops. In September, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It freed all slaves in Confederate territory on January 1, 1863. The proclamation also allowed blacks to enlist in the Union Army. It was an amazing milestone. Frederick knew the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't perfect. For one thing, Lincoln didn't really have control over any of the slaves in Confederate territory. There were also 1 million slaves in the border states, slave states that had remained in the Union. The proclamation didn't free them, but the Emancipation Proclamation was a turning point in the war and in the fight against slavery. On January 1, news that the proclamation had officially been signed came into the Boston church, where Frederick waited with 3,000 others. The crowd erupted into shouts of praise, sobs and tears, and celebrated long into the night. Now Frederick could work to recruit black soldiers. The governor of Massachusetts asked for his help filling the ranks of the 54th Regiment Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, a regiment of all black troops. Frederick wrote a powerful article titled "Men of Color, to Arms," to rally blacks to freedom. And here's a picture of them. "This is your hour and mine," he wrote. "The iron gate of our prison stands open." He traveled through the North, signing up black troops. Frederick's sons, Lewis and Charles, were among the first to enlist. In all, nearly 200,000 blacks would fight bravely for the Union and help win many battles. But Frederick was troubled when he found that black soldiers were not treated the same as whites. Black soldiers received about half the pay of white soldiers. They got little training, were not commissioned as officers, and were not rewarded for bravery. Frederick used his pen and his words, writing letters and speaking out for equal treatment. Then he went to Washington, D.C. to request a meeting with President Lincoln. Here was a former slave, one who had openly disagreed with the president, hoping to meet with the most powerful man in the nation. How would he be received? Would he be received at all? At the White House, President Lincoln welcomed Frederick as an equal. He listened carefully to his concerns and agreed that black soldiers had proved themselves in battle. Here they are meeting. Frederick didn't get all the answers he hoped for that day, but he was encouraged by Lincoln's attention and felt the president was a good man. By the end of the war, black soldiers got equal pay and were allowed to become officers. Some received medals for bravery. Later in the war, Lincoln invited Frederick back to Washington. He asked for his help designing a plan to evacuate slaves from the South if the Union did not win the war. Respect between the two men grew. President Lincoln was re-elected in 1864. After Lincoln's second inauguration in March 1865, Frederick went to the reception at the White House to congratulate him. Here's a picture of them. No black American had ever done this, and police tried to keep Frederick out. But when Lincoln saw him, he said boldly, "Here comes my friend Douglass." Lincoln wanted to know what Frederick thought of the speech he'd given that day. "There is no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours," Lincoln said. 5 weeks later, the Civil War ended with the South surrendering. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, adopted later that year, abolished slavery forever. What had seemed impossible to young Frederick was now reality. 4 million black people were free. Frederick felt exceeding joy over these stupendous achievements, especially the abolition of slavery, which had been the deepest desire and the great labor of my life. Lincoln now faced the difficult task of reuniting the country. He wanted to bind up the nation's wounds and welcome back the southern states, but this job would be left to others. 5 days after the Confederate surrender, President Lincoln was shot and killed by a pro-slavery actor named John Wilkes Booth. Frederick shared the nation's shock and sorrow at the loss of their great president, a man he called so amiable, so kind, humane, and honest that one is at a loss to know how he could have had an enemy on earth. And although Frederick was overjoyed by the abolition of slavery, he also felt lost. With slavery gone, my voice was no longer needed, Frederick wrote. Where should I go and what should I do? Chapter 8, Marshall Douglass. Frederick needn't have worried about what would occupy his time. Invitations poured in for him to speak at lecture halls and colleges. In the late 1860s, lectures provided audiences with a mix of education and entertainment. It was a good job and paid well. But Frederick was not finished in his quest for equal rights. Although blacks were not slaves, they were not yet quite free. Blacks were not citizens. They could not vote. Frederick felt strongly that this newfound freedom wouldn't mean much until Black Americans had a say in government affairs. Frederick spoke out, as always, and supported those in power who shared his views. In 1868, the 14th Amendment made former slaves citizens and granted all citizens the same protection under America's laws. In 1870, the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. The American Anti-Slave Society disbanded that year. At its last meeting, Frederick said, "I seem to myself to be living in a new world." Still, many did not welcome blacks' progress. In 1872, Frederick and Anna's home in Rochester was burned. Deeply saddened, the couple moved to Washington, D.C. There, Frederick was asked to run a black bank where former slaves could invest their new savings. The bank had not been doing well, and its owners hoped Frederick's name and image would help to bring it around. But the bank collapsed only 3 months later. Frederick was humiliated. In 1877, President Hayes appointed Frederick U.S. Marshal of the District of Columbia. The Reconstruction. The period after the Civil War was known as the Reconstruction. The enormous task of reuniting North and South fell to President Andrew Johnson, who was a Southerner and did not share Lincoln's vision. There were 4 million slaves, former slaves, without food, homes, or money, and this is Andrew Johnson. Few could read or write. A government agency called the Freedmen's Bureau helped provide basic needs and established thousands of public schools and several colleges for blacks. Soldiers from the North were stationed in the South to help protect blacks and their rights. By 1875, 16 black men had been elected to Congress and hundreds served in their state legislatures. However, the progress was short-lived. When the Reconstruction ended and U.S. troops left the South in 1877, most of the gains blacks had made disappeared. Frederick's post was an honor and a first for a black man, though he had little power. He and Anna brought a large home overlooking Washington. The house, named Cedar Hill, was an elegant place to welcome friends and family. Here's the picture. In 1881, Frederick published his third autobiography, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. Frederick's second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, had been published in 1855. Around the time Frederick bought Cedar Hill, a friend invited him back to St. Michael's, Maryland. Thomas Auld, now in his 80s and very sick, learned Frederick was there and asked him to visit. There they are. Once master and slave, the two now met as equals. Frederick held Thomas's hand as they spoke freely about the past. Frederick asked what his old master thought of his running away. "Frederick, I always knew you were too smart to be a slave," Thomas replied, "and had I been in your place, I should have done as you did." The two parted on good terms. Thomas died soon after. In 1882, Anna died. The family missed her terribly. Frederick was lonely, and after more than a year without Anna, he thought about remarrying. The previous year, President James A. Garfield had appointed Frederick Recorder of Deeds for the District of Columbia. There's the president. In that position, Frederick hired a clerk named Helen Pitts. Helen believed in equal rights and in votes for women. She and Frederick had much in common. They fell in love, and in 1884 they married. Frederick and Helen were happy, but many others were outraged. Helen was 20 years younger than Frederick, and she was white. Here's a picture of her. Even Frederick's children were upset, but Frederick saw no problem with the union. He said his first wife was black, like his mother, and his second wife was white, like his father. Together, Frederick and Helen toured Europe. From 1889 to 1891, they lived in Haiti, where Frederick served as U.S. Minister and Consul General. Between and after his travels, Frederick continued to speak out for equal rights and against the violence blacks experienced in the South. He was growing tired. Still, he fought for liberty until the very end. On February 20th, 1895, after attending a women's rights meeting, Frederick had a heart attack and died. He was 77. The nation had lost its most famous and ardent black leader. Black schools in Washington closed for his funeral. Thousands passed by his casket to pay their respects at Metropolitan AME Church in Washington and then at City Hall in Rochester. Statues and monuments would be built in Rochester, New York City, and Baltimore. Schools, roads, and bridges have been named in his honor. Here's a picture of a statue of him. With his courage to do and say things no black man had done before, Frederick Douglass broke barriers between the races and inspired other civil rights activists. He will always be remembered for his passionate work to make America a better place, one that lives up to the ideals it was founded upon and guarantees freedom for all. And that is the end of Who Was Frederick Douglass by April Jones Pintz. I hope you enjoyed reading about this wonderful man. My name is Cindy. I am one of the children's librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and I thank you for stopping by. Bye-bye, friends.